Hello everyone. I wanted to thank you all for listening so much. It really means a lot to me. And this video that we'll be doing today, as you probably have noticed from the title, is sort of an introduction to sort of classical history or ancient history. And this is by no means a deep dive into any specific civilization from the past. It's really just a broad overview to sort of give you an introduction where it'll help you branch off in the future and just gives you a starting point to find some new interests that you might want to further explore. Our main source that I'll be using today is The History of the Ancient World, from the earliest accounts to the fall of Rome, by Susan Weiss Bauer, who's an excellent historian, actually has 3 books in the series so far. The other one's covering the medieval period and the Renaissance period. And I should mention ahead of time that this will certainly have a bit of a Western perspective. I'll be talking about cultures from all over the world, but the timeline is sort of a Western perspective because I'm going to end the ancient period at the fall of the Western Roman Empire, as her book does as well. So anyway, thank you so much for listening to this video. Please like and subscribe and comment down below. So I want to keep the comments to where essentially we can continue the conversation and we can all learn together. So if you have any interesting questions or things I got wrong that you want to correct me on, as long as you're polite and we can continue the conversation, I think that's excellent. So anyway, enjoy the video. So we begin now with the Paleolithic period, which is actually when we begin to see the Homo genus come up, which is we are obviously Homo sapiens. So there you have like Homo habilis and Homo erectus, and eventually Homo sapiens, and there's some others in between. And in this time period, this is when we start to see the use of tools, and it begins roughly, there's some evidence of it happening about 3 million years ago, but other evidence showing about 2.5 million years ago, maybe a more accurate estimation. And it's divided into a bunch of different stages, essentially progressing in the complication or how complicated the tools that these people are using. We also see some cave paintings happening many years ago, but it sort of nears more of the end of the Paleolithic period. From there we move to the Mesolithic period, which is basically the time period of hunter-gatherers, and it's from about 20,000 years ago to about 5,000 years ago, depending on where in the world you're looking. We also start to see textiles and pottery becoming more prevalent, though agriculture not around. As I mentioned, everyone's kind of hunter-gatherers at this point. And the burial sites that we see from this time period are quite simple, but we do see even more cave paintings beginning to show up. Then we have the Neolithic, which started roughly around 10,000 years ago, or it should be 10,000 BC to 5,000 BC, depending on where you're looking. And this is when we begin to see the domestication of livestock, crops being raised, and villages are starting to form. They have sheep and goats, cattle, pigs, and more beginning to be domesticated. Mainly wheat and barley are what is grown, but there was other crops as well. And in the Fertile Crescent of like Iraq and Iran, this is where we really see civilizations beginning to form. China was a bit late to the party. At about 3500 BCE was when we really started to see civilization forming. And India was much earlier, about 7000 BCE. In the Americas, we see maize, and beans and squash as well, being domesticated in like Mexico and Central America, and that was about 6500 BC. Though the villages start to form a little bit later than that. This leads us into the Bronze Age, which is roughly between like 3000 BC and 1200 BC. And we get early forms of writing in places like Mesopotamia, which has cuneiform, and Egypt has hieroglyphics. And as I mentioned, it's the Bronze Age, so bronze comes from smelting copper with tin or another metal to make it harder. And we're getting sort of like early pottery kilns to make a more complex pottery here. And the wheel is invented. and we begin to use animals as tools with ox-drawn plows and things like that. And eventually this will help develop civilization further as we go, which leads into the Iron Age, which we get just hotter kilns, basically capable of making iron, which started in the ancient Near East around 1200 BC. Here I will briefly mention Göbekli Tepe, which you may have heard of. It was in southeastern Turkey, somewhere between 9500 and 8000 BC. It's not tremendously well known, like we don't have tremendous knowledge of the civilization that lived there, but there probably wasn't much agriculture being cultivated there, and didn't have many permanent inhabitants. It was more of like a religious site. They likely lived in villages and were more hunter-gatherers. Our first real major civilization that we'll talk about is actually ancient Sumer, which you may have heard of, and it's one of the most interesting civilizations in ancient history. It was along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, sort of in Iraq. And they had writing dating back to somewhere around 4000 BC, maybe a bit later. But they did have agriculture, and they had some major cities, Uruk being one of them, which probably had around 50,000 people in its heyday. Eridu was another one, Kish being another one as well. And they had some internal problems over the years, as all civilizations do, fighting some civil wars and also battling sort of enemies on their borders. They had slavery, which they used to help build their cities, and they were led by a priest king and a council of elders. They had some amazing innovations. For instance, they had schools and irrigation techniques that were new. They had weaving and leatherwork, things like that. Interestingly, they also have a flood origin story, which we see throughout many civilizations, including in the Bible. They divided time in an interesting way, with hours being 60 minutes and minutes being 60 seconds. And they also had walls surrounding their cities. They were at this time just sort of made of mud, so they're not really durable walls, but there wasn't much that was going to take the walls down at that time, of course, you need to remember. And they traded with their neighbors things like grain and pottery and copper, stuff like that. There also was a Neo-Sumerian Empire later, which was ruled by the third dynasty of Ur. And they had a lot of problems as the Tigris and Euphrates sort of increased in salination, so it had more salt in it, which destroyed their crops, and they ended up getting basically taken over by, I believe it was the Amorites. The regular Sumerian Empire was conquered by the Akkadians in 2270 BC. Next, we'll talk about the Indus Valley civilization, or the Harappan civilization, as it heard it be referred to as. Which was around between 2500 and 1700 BCE near the Indus River in modern-day Pakistan. It was a significant civilization which had irrigation, as well as annual floods, which helped grow its crops in a similar way that Egypt did. It had cotton, and it also had a domestication of dogs and cats, and cattle, and potentially even pigs. And it traded extensively with its neighbors, and had an interesting system of weights and measures, which was highly regulated, as well as it must have had a strong centralized government, because it had some civil works like granaries and things like that. But it did have some social stratification, as well as some enemies at the gates, which, like many civilizations, internal struggles mixed with external struggles generally leads to the destruction of civilizations. So this one fell as well. This next one's quite brief. It's called Newgrange, Ireland, it's much older than Stonehenge, and it's probably built around 3200 BC. And it's just sort of a burial site. We don't actually have much of a civilization living there. It's just that they use it as a burial site, and it's a very cool structure. We then moved to South America for a civilization called Norte Chico, which was in Peru, or what is now Peru, from the 30th century to roughly the 18th century BCE. And the interesting thing about this civilization is that we actually can't find evidence of much warfare happening. We don't have burnt buildings or mutilated bodies in the streets or things like that. And it doesn't seem that the cities were oriented in a way as to be defensive towards enemies that could be attacking them, which is kind of interesting and sort of goes against most of our historical knowledge of other civilizations. And these people predated the Olmecs by roughly 2,000 years, which is hard to believe. They also had sort of terraced pyramids were their major structures that they built. In China, prior to the Jia and Shang dynasties, you have what's called the Longshan, which is a early pre-dynastic China civilization, which has some solar observatories and some pottery, and they also have a few famous kings, namely the philosopher king Fuji, the farmer king Shennong, and the Yellow Emperor Huangdi, who started to sort of unify the territory after the defeat of his brother, which all happened prior to about 2600 BC. In Iran, we have the Elamite civilization, which really reached its sort of peak between about 1200 and 1100 BC. And they were, this was under Shutrukids, which I'm probably terribly pronouncing this ruler's name. But they interacted with many different civilizations around them at the time, including they traded with the Indus Valley civilization. They also conquered parts of Babylonia, though later they were defeated by Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar I. They also interacted with ancient Assyria as well. Next we head to Crete for the ancient Minoans, which began around probably 3500 BC, and about 2000 BC is when we get the more complex societies, and around 1100 when they collapse and the Greeks head into their dark ages. Basically, it's derived around a mythical king Minos, and also you may know the name from the Minotaur, who was half man, half bull, trapped in the labyrinth. They traded all over Greece and with Egypt and beyond as well, and they had interesting architecture with complex palaces that were multiple stories high, and they also had complex plumbing systems. But like most civilizations, they ebbed and flowed over time with natural disasters and invasions and things like that, and eventually, like I said, faltered out around 1100 BC. Skara Brae in Scotland is sort of a minor civilization, but they're interesting to talk about because most people don't know about them unless, of course, you're Scottish. But they lasted probably from around 3180 BC to 2500 BC, somewhere in there. And we see some architecture built by them, these sort of cluster houses that were made of stones and earth, and they have hearths and beds and cupboards and toilets and things like that. And it's actually older than Stonehenge and the pyramids of Giza as well, interestingly. Stonehenge is a place you probably heard of in England, and these stones are roughly 13 feet high, 7 feet wide, and they weigh roughly 25 tons, and they align with sunrise on the summer solstice. There's burial mounds nearby, and people still, perhaps they use them for worship, and I know that people still to this day, who are into various forms of paganism, do go to these places as forms of worship. But this culture didn't really leave much written record behind, so a lot of the things we've had to study just through digging up and trying to understand the area as best we can. Now, the actual methods of moving these rocks is heavily debated. They could have used tracks of logs that they put the rocks on. They could have greased them and put them on sleighs. They could have used various different leg systems. We're not exactly sure. We do know that they had to move them quite a decent distance, though. Now we move on to probably what will be one of the more popular civilizations that people like to learn about, which is ancient Egypt. Now, this civilization began to form as the Nile flooded a bit less than it once did, and because of decreased rains. So people began to settle near the Nile, which ended up being pretty reliable, as you'd have a flooding season and then you could grow crops. Now, the Nile has everything you need for civilization except for wood, so they did have to get wood from other places. And it initially started out with sort of two kingdoms during the Old Kingdom period, which were known as the Red and White Kingdoms. Now, they were unified by the Scorpion King, who was on the White Kingdom side, in around 3200 BC, so quite a long time ago. Wheat and barley were sort of staples, and bread was eaten constantly. It was such a significant portion of the diet that you can actually look at ancient Egyptian mummies' teeth, and you can see how worn down they are from eating the bread that would have sand in it. And they used generally pots to grow vegetables and fruits, because the ground wasn't always the most hospitable. And they ate tons of fish as well. And they did have some domesticated animals, such as donkeys, which I believe they used for work. They also had goats, sheep, pigs, things like that. Also, you probably heard this, but they did use papyrus for writing as well. The state essentially under the pharaoh was where he basically owned the land, but in reality, a lot of people, like the citizens, used it for agriculture mainly. And there was slavery, but it was mostly debt slavery, or foreigners or prisoners of war that they would use to build or work the lands. Now, the most obvious achievement of the ancient Egyptians is the pyramids, which people still frequent to this day. But they had other achievements as well, such as in mathematics, and they understood a little bit about the solar system. They had some early medicine, though obviously this is quite early. They did have some effectiveness, and they had irrigation systems as well. Interestingly, they also had what is probably the earliest known peace treaty, which they made with the Hittites. You may have heard that the ancient Egypt is divided into various different periods, like the Old Kingdom, Middle Period, and the New Kingdom. Now, the Old Kingdom is roughly between like 2700 and 2200 BC, and this is when we get the pyramids of Giza and the Great Sphinx. The pyramids were built essentially to celebrate the pharaohs after their death, so they had something to continue on their lives. And the civilization, the Old Kingdom, really began to fall apart because there was challenges to the pharaoh's power, and also there began to have agricultural problems like droughts and famine and things like that. The Middle Kingdom lasts between 2130 BC and 1700 BC roughly. And essentially this begins to come to an end because of flooding, as well as they were getting some pressure from other civilizations such as the Hyksos. The New Kingdom was formed under Ahmose I, and essentially he began to kick out the Hyksos as well as the Kushites in the south, and he became quite successful militarily as Egypt tried to expand its borders. Around this time is when we start to hear of a lot of the famous pharaohs that you may be familiar with, like King Tut and Hatshepsut and others like that. The first peace treaty, which I mentioned before, was around 1258 BC under King Ramses II, who managed to defeat the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh. Soon some instability follows, though, as we begin to see them get attacked by these people they just refer to as the Sea Peoples, and this seems to happen over and over again. And then the Kushites actually take control of the empire, followed by the Assyrians. Following that, we actually see Persia take control of it. And Egypt did regain control for a little while, but Persia then took it back. And this time period is from about 653 BC to 332 BC. And if you know your history, you'll know the reason the Persians lost it in 332 is because Alexander the Great conquered it. Following Alexander, we get the Ptolemaic rule, which includes people like Cleopatra. And if you know your history again, Cleopatra and Julius Caesar interact with each other, and Egypt sort of becomes more under the sway of Rome's power under Julius, and then eventually even more under Augustus Caesar. The ancient civilization of Kerma in Nubia began around 3000 BC, but really flourished between around 2500 and 1500 BC. We have many amazing statues from this civilization, and we also have some tombs that we found from them. Now, this civilization did interact heavily with ancient Egypt, and at one point even joined forces with the Hyksos to try to defeat Egypt, and they were pretty successful at this. They managed to get quite a bit of land, but by 1500 BC they were fully defeated by Egypt. The Mayans are one of the most interesting and most well-known civilizations from the Americas, particularly for their Mayan calendar, but they did have other interesting things. They're really good at astronomy, mathematics, and things like that. it was around 2000 BC, a little bit after that we start to see some more complex societies being formed with agriculture. But it wasn't until around 750 BC that we begin to see these larger cities developing. And their main crops were maize, beans, squash, and chili peppers. I'm fortunate enough to be able to say that I have been to the city of Chichen Itza, which is a very interesting site if you want to go see it someday. And though we're jumping a bit ahead of the time period we're actually covering here, the Mayans were, of course, colonized in the 16th century by the Spanish. The ancient Assyrian Empire was a Mesopotamian civilization that existed from the 21st century BC to the 14th century BC. And there's several different periods of the civilization, from the Old Assyrian Empire to the Middle Assyrian and even the Neo-Assyrian Empire as well. They had most of their control during the Middle Assyrian period, and they often fought with the ancient Babylonians. And eventually they were conquered by the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The previously mentioned Babylonians was another Mesopotamian civilization, and there's basically two empires here, the Old Babylonian and the Neo-Babylonian. And Hammurabi founded the Old Babylonian Empire, but it fell as he had a series of bad rulers after him, and it was ruled by the Assyrians, Kassites, Elamites, and others. And then later was the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which is when the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were under Nebuchadnezzar II. The Akkadian Empire was another Mesopotamian civilization that conquered Sumer, and it peaked roughly between the 24th and 22nd centuries BC. It was founded by Sargon of Akkad, and it existed near the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Now, we do actually see Sargon mentioned in the Bible in Genesis 10 through 12. And Sargon captured Samaria at the Battle of Uruk, and he supposedly reigned for 56 years, though that's debated. He conquered Sumer, Elam, and Martu, and potentially even moved to Babylon at one point. The Gutians invaded, so Gutia kings ruled for a while, but they were defeated by Utuhegal, which I probably butchered there. Interestingly, they had a planned economy with rationed food supplies and taxation in the form of food or labor, which was standard back then. And the society, we think, collapsed because of environmental changes, rebellion, or invasion, which is pretty much how most civilizations collapse, and a small dark age followed. The Zhou Dynasty in China is actually debated whether it was a real thing or not. It follows the Longshan civilization and predates the Shang Dynasty. It probably lasts, if it did exist, between about 2000 BC and 1600 BC. And it's considered the first dynasty of China, potentially, if not the Shang. And it was established by Yu the Great, but it really doesn't have written records, which makes us unsure how legitimate it was. But this is where we see the establishment of the Mandate of Heaven, though. And the warring emperors eventually formed together to form the Shang Dynasty. Now we'll talk about Judaism and the Hebrews. So essentially, these are the early people to believe in one God, and we believe that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were around 2166 to 1990 BC, roughly. So Abraham heard the voice of God in his head, and this God was Yahweh, which sort of began monotheism. Abraham likely moved to Egypt due to famine, and at that point, he actually ended up saying that his wife Sarai was his sister, and she was sold into the Pharaoh's harem, which became cursed because she was in it. Then they moved to the city of Hebron, which Sarai was put into another harem, now with her name as Sarah, and again, this harem was cursed. And then Isaac is born, but he's born very late into Abraham and Sarah's lives. They were promised a child by God, and he did deliver, but it was much later than they expected to. Then a relative of Isaac is brought to him by his parents, named Rebekah, and the two get married. And both of Abraham's sons were marked with the sign of the covenant, and they were circumcised and formed two nations. Abraham then founds the Hebrews, and then Jacob struggled with an angel and was given the name Israel, which means to struggle with God. Then there was a drought, and Jacob and his 12 sons moved to Egypt, where they formed the 12 tribes of Israel. They are enslaved and led out of Egypt, back to Canaan by Moses. Joshua helps them capture Canaan. Israel is formed around 900 BC, and Judah around 700 BC. The Israelite monarchy really is established in about 1037 BC under King Saul, and continues with David and Solomon. Jerusalem was conquered from the Jebusites, which became sort of the capital of the kingdom. And later they built the first temple there in Jerusalem. Soon a civil war erupts between the tribes, and then the kingdoms are split into Israel and Judah, as I previously mentioned. Judah's capital was at Jerusalem, and Israel was captured and destroyed by the Neo-Assyrian Empire in 720. There we saw the beginning of some revolts as various civilizations attacked the Jews, and King Nebuchadnezzar II in the Neo-Babylonian Empire destroyed the first temple in 586. This basically caused Jews to flood all over. Many actually went to Babylon, and all over the Middle East and Africa as well. The second temple was completed in 516 BC, and the final Torah was completed somewhere between 450 and 350 BC. Later we see King Herod appointed king of the Jews, and after that we see Jesus being crucified, which I'm sure is a story we're all familiar with. And the Jews had lots of problems with Rome. They often revolted, and Jerusalem and other places were sacked, and temples were destroyed. And throughout the rest of history, as we know, Jews have faced tons of discrimination and persecution. We'll cover the main bit of Greek history in a minute, but for now we're going to talk about Mycenaean Greece, which is sort of the last phase of the Bronze Age of Greece, starting between 1750 and going to about 1050 BC. This really sets the stage for Greece as we know it, with arts and writings coming from this time period. And there's a few cities we recognize as well, like Athens and Thebes, already quite prominent, but becoming more so later. Now, it was dominated by a warrior elite generally, and they were polytheistic, as you probably know from Greek mythology. Also, they were heavily influenced by Minoan Crete, but they ended up getting hit by a volcano and a number of different things, leading to their destruction in about 1500 BC, and this is also the time where the Acropolis is built. Earlier I mentioned the Zhou Dynasty, but as I said, it's actually debated whether this dynasty really existed, so the Shang Dynasty is the first true dynasty of China. At least that's what scholars say. Now, it was founded somewhere around 1760 BC and lasted until about 1030 BC, though it is debated whether it ended a little bit earlier than that, maybe. It's founded around the Yellow River, and interestingly, they had a 360-day calendar, so pretty close to what we have now, and we also have some early writing around this time. Their houses were made of just dirt and timber, so quite simple. They did use bronze, occasionally for utensils and plates and things like that, though it was somewhat rare. They had clay pottery as well. We don't have any literature of this time, but there is some records and things like that, so we do know, again, that they were writing. These records were actually often carved into bones, which is kind of interesting. They did have some irrigation systems that they used, though they were quite basic. And one other thing we know about them is that they were frequently at war, and they did have chariots that they used in these wars, some of which the royal households would be buried with these chariots often. Next we have the Hittites, which were in modern-day Turkey, and they existed between around 1600 and 1180 BC, though their peak was around 1300. We do see them mentioned in the Bible, and interesting, the time period that they existed covers both the Bronze and Iron Age, and in their later years during the Iron Age they had iron weapons, which turned out to be quite effective. Like most civilizations at the time, they were ruled by a king, and they were polytheistic. They used cuneiform, which they likely got from the Mesopotamians, and As I mentioned previously in the Egypt section, they actually are pretty well known for the Battle of Kadesh, where they fought Ramses II's army, and this is where the first peace treaty that we know of in the world came from. And in 1180 they were invaded by the Sea Peoples, which I mentioned again in the Egypt section, and their society began to collapse. Here I'll briefly mention the Kassites, which ruled the area of Babylon after the old Babylonian Empire collapsed in 1595. They ruled this area for about 400 years, and they were quite prosperous, but ended up having issues with the Assyrians and the Elamites as well. But eventually their civilization began to collapse, and the Neo-Babylonian Empire began. The Phoenicians are another biblically mentioned people, and they were seafaring people who traveled all around the Mediterranean. They lasted quite a long time under a few different names, from around 3200 BC to 330 BC. And as I mentioned, they were seafaring people, so they were excellent shipbuilders. And interestingly, they dyed clothes in purples, which various different civilizations began to like. We hear about Mesopotamians wearing them, and also the Romans later would love purple for their leaders as well. The Phoenicians gave the Greeks their alphabet, and ours is based off it as well. This area is known biblically as Canaan, and Alexander the Great conquered this area in 322 BC. Now, probably the most famous Phoenician city is Carthage, which was founded by the famous Queen Dido. And it's one of the most beautiful ancient cities. If you look up recreations of it, you can see how stunning it is. And Carthage fought Rome during the two Punic Wars, so you may have heard of that as well. The first civilization in Mexico was the Olmecs, and they used rubber from the rubber tree. They did not have writing, but they do have some glyphs that we found carved in caves. They carved stone heads from rock, and they played that game that you may have seen where you hit the ball with your hips and try to make it through the hoop. They made artifacts from jade, obsidian, and other stones. And cities were more for ceremonies than for actually living. They generally lived in villages, and they grew all sorts of crops like maize, beans, squash, sweet potatoes, cotton, and more. Now, we don't actually know why the civilization declined, but it's theorized that it happened because of environmental changes like the silting up of rivers and potentially volcanic activity. In China, after the Shang Dynasty, we have the Zhou Dynasty, which had actually two periods, the Western and Eastern Zhou, which went from about 1046 to about 771 BC in the Western Zhou, and 771 BC to 256 for the Eastern Zhou. This is when we start seeing the mandate of heaven begin to be talked about. It was basically the divine right of the monarch. It was similar to feudalism in the sense that there were sort of nobles that owned land. They were beholden to a king, and then peasants worked the land. We see a lot of Chinese culture be formed in this time period, like Confucianism, Taoism, legalism, etc. And we also see famous Chinese intellectuals and famous people in history like Lao Tzu, Sun Tzu, Confucius, people like that. During this time, we also had what was known as the Warring States period, a very famous period in Chinese history, when essentially it began to be believed that the monarch had lost the mandate of heaven, therefore it was essentially up for grabs, and war began. I've already covered Mycenaean Greece and the Minoans and other civilizations, but really I'm going to cover now Greece more broadly. Ancient Greece was basically just a bunch of city-states that we have lumped together because they share some bit of culture. And really Greece is where we see the foundation of Western civilization. I mean, after all, it brought us Western philosophy like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and more, as well as the great epics of Homer, the mathematics of Pythagoras and Euclid, and the plays of Sophocles, and even the history of Herodotus. We even look to ancient Athens as the foundation of democracy, so we owe so much to these people. Now, a little bit more about them is they started off as a skilled sort of seafaring people who traveled around the Aegean. There's a number of different civilizations that come out of this that I've discussed before. The Cycladic people, the Minoans, the Mycenaeans, and then we go into the Greek Dark Ages for a while, which we don't really have writing of. That's between 1100 and 800 BC, right after the Mycenaeans. After that, we get the foundation of the Greek city-states that were previously mentioned, which flows right into the classical period, which is what we most think of when we think of Greece. This lasts from about 500 to 300 BC, which is sort of the foundation is found in the Battle of Marathon, where Pericles begins building the Acropolis during this time. And it leads all the way essentially to the death of Alexander and just right after that. The classical period is also the time period when we see the death of Leonidas and his 300 Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae. And now, just mentioning him, I'd like to mention a bit more about Sparta, because I think it's one of the more interesting societies in ancient Greece. They were a militaristic society, which you probably remember that they would throw babies off of cliffs if they appeared deformed. It had kings and priests, and a council of 28, which did help with making decisions within the society. But according to Susan Weiss-Bauer, the real ruler was an unwritten code of laws which governed all of Spartan society. They had interesting practices, such as the way that children were often owned by the society as a whole, instead of just parents. And everyone ate in mess halls so that no one could get too much food compared to others. And much of their roofs and doors were made from just axe and saw, so they would appear quite rough, and people wouldn't desire luxurious furniture next to them. Now, the Spartans did eventually defeat the Persians, but they did create a new enemy of actually their fellow Greeks. The Athenians built the Delian League to protect against future Persian invasions, and Sparta didn't like the power that this gave them, so they built the Peloponnesian League, and these two actually fought each other twice, which led to basically the second time that it led to the destruction of Athens, and it led to the bankruptcy of Sparta. The Greeks were finally united under Philip II of Macedon, which is actually Alexander the Great's father, who Alexander took the throne in 336 BC after his father's death. And he expanded into Egypt, into Persia, and even India, and was a student of Aristotle personally, which is interesting. He died in 323 BC, and the Hellenistic period followed with battles between a divided empire of his generals. Macedon was eventually defeated by Rome at the Battle of Pydna, and steadily grew more under the control of Rome as the decades wore on. The kingdom of Kush is in North Africa and modern Sudan, and the early civilization probably dates back thousands of years, but really hits its heyday between 1069 and 350 BC. As Egypt was losing power during the New Kingdom, the Kush were able to grow and gain power and eventually ruled the 25th dynasty under King Kashta, and this ended when the Assyrians invaded in 666 BC. The Egyptians regained strength and sacked the capital at Napata in 590 BC, and then the new capital was also sacked in 330 CE, which toppled the kingdom. The Persians were an ancient civilization in what is now Iran, and it's actually a series of civilizations that lead up to the Persian civilization, of course. So you have the Elamites, who were conquered by the Sumerians, then the Assyrians, then the Medias, and then the Medes were conquered by what we now begin to think of as Persia under the Achaemenid Empire, which was from around 550 to 330 BC, before it was conquered by Alexander, and then the Seleucids, then the Parthians, then the Sasanians, which lasted until the Arab Muslim conquest of the 7th century. The first great Persian empire started with Cyrus the Great, who founded the Achaemenid Empire in 550 BC. He built canals and got aquifers, so he brought water to the lands that he conquered. The Persians were often quite gentle rulers, as people were basically free to do as they pleased, and even freed people like the Jews from the Babylonians, as long as they served in his armies and paid taxes. He also expanded posts along major roadways with food, horses, and rest areas for messengers, and they even expanded into Egypt and further. Darius I lost to the Greeks at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC, and his son Xerxes tried to take Greece, but was again unsuccessful, though I'm sure you remember him from the battle with the Spartans and Leonidas. As previously mentioned, Alexander conquered Persia, but at his death in 323 BC, the Seleucid Empire was formed. And this empire actually became quite Greek in the way it was administered. The Seleucids were defeated by Rome and then conquered by the Parthians. The Parthians were somewhat successful against Rome, but eventually did get weakened, and the Sasanian Empire continued tolerance of other peoples under its rule, and it's considered the great height of Persian culture. They were successful against Rome, even capturing the Roman Emperor Valerian at one point, and this ended, as I mentioned, with the Muslim conquest of the 7th century. The Qin dynasty in China lasted from 221 to 206 BC, so quite a short dynasty. This is the first dynasty of Imperial China, meaning that China was centralized after the Warring States period, and is founded by Shi Huangdi. It operated under legalism, and during this time he built roads and trade routes and began the Great Wall of China. The terracotta warriors were also made during this time as well. And the empire ended at 206 BC due to the creation of a police state from fear of instability, which angered citizens, and then a bad line of rulers followed. The Han dynasty lasted from 202 BC to 220 CE, so quite a bit longer than the previous dynasty. It was founded by Liu Bang and had a Western Han period and an Eastern Han period, as we've seen previously. This is due to a usurper who tried to found a new dynasty but failed. Confucianism replaced legalism during this time. The Silk Roads, created by the Emperor Wu, now traded with the West, and literacy was encouraged as well as historical study. The Han dynasty fell as the corrupt imperial court took power from the emperor. These were eunuchs and generals, and they began warring with one another, splitting the empire into 3 kingdoms. I should of course mention the Silk Roads, which, as its name implies, transported silk from China basically to the west. It was established by the Han dynasty in 130 BC and lasted over 1500 years. And west to east, many things were transported, like honey, fruits, horses, dogs, glassware, things like that. And from east to west, things like silk, teas, dyes, spices, and other things like that. The Silk Road was eventually closed by the Ottomans, which started actually the Age of Discovery, interestingly, because the West still wanted goods from the East. The Jin dynasty went from 266 CE to 420 CE. Founded by Emperor Wu, China was reunited after the Three Kingdoms period. This period faced almost constant internal struggles and was invaded on several occasions by barbarians. Overall, it was a very unstable time for China. The Gupta Empire in India went from 320 to 550 CE. It was founded by Chandragupta and is thought of as a golden age of India because of its arts, architecture, philosophy, science, etc. The Sanskrit epics came out of this time period, and it was divided into provinces and divided even further to decentralize the government. In the end, it was invaded by the Huns, and the empire began to wither away. The Huns were well known in the 4th and 5th centuries, and they're from Central Asia east of the Volga River. They then migrated west and pushed many people into the Roman Empire, including the Goths and many more. They were generally mounted archers and were extremely effective. Not only did they take on the Western Roman Empire, but they also fought the later Persian Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire as well. Best known for Attila the Hun, who managed to beat the Eastern Roman Empire into peace treaties and tribute payments a few times, and faced some success against the Western Roman Empire, but never was able to sack Rome. He died in 453 of a hemorrhage on his wedding night. After his death, the Huns had internal power struggles and never rose to their previous power again. The Visigoths are an ancient civilization that split off from the Ostrogoths in the 4th century. They were pushed south into the Roman Empire by the Huns in 376, and in 378 they killed the Roman Emperor Valens at Adrianople. However, later they did briefly ally with the Roman Empire, and they were given the job of protecting the Balkans. But that didn't last for very long, and in 410 they actually ended up sacking Rome itself. Rome wasn't their only enemy, though. Attila the Hun killed their king, Theodoric I. From there, the Visigoths had to find allies wherever they could find them, and they did ally again with Rome, off and on, though this certainly was a tumultuous relationship. The Visigoths were all over Spain and parts of Gaul, and eventually the Franks under Clovis united and defeated the Visigoths. However, they did play a very important part in history, and later they would help take Spain back from the Muslims. The Vandals were another civilization at this time who tried to avoid the Huns, and they too invaded parts of Gaul and Spain. Later they moved to North Africa, where they became a federate of Rome, though they often clashed, and this was not a steady relationship. At one point they even captured Carthage and really established their own government. Next they took Sardinia, Corsica, and Sicily as well. And in 455 they managed to sack Rome itself, only eventually getting defeated by the Byzantine Empire. Now of course we have to cover everyone's favorite, ancient Rome. So Rome began as a small group of villages somewhere around 700 BC. The story goes that Romulus and Remus were twins of the god Mars and were nursed to health by a she-wolf after being set adrift in a basket in the Tiber River by the king of Alba. They grew to kill the corrupt king, but eventually fought each other, and Romulus killed Remus. I think this is kind of similar to the story of Cain and Abel, you may notice. After that, we move into a period of kings, which isn't well recorded. However, eventually corruption caused the Roman people to overthrow the monarchy, supposedly after the king's son raped a noblewoman named Lucretia, which is probably untrue, but provides an interesting patriotic story for the later Romans. The patricians and the plebeians were essentially the two classes, with plebeians gaining right through popular movements against the patrician class, which had all the power. We then get a consulship instead of a kingship, and this begins the Roman Republic. The Republic consisted of mainly a Rex Sancrorum, which was a priest-king, 2 consuls, and the Senate. Now they also would occasionally elect a dictator when times called for a seriously centralized government where decisions could be made quick. There was various assemblies and tribunes that represented groups such as the plebeians or military units or other groups. Rome had a strong law with a constitution that had checks and balances as well as some separations of power. Over the years they faced many enemies, including Carthage 3 times during the 3 Punic Wars, all of which Rome was successful in, but Hannibal in the Second Punic War did prove to be a challenge for them. They of course also defeated the Macedonians and the Seleucids, and gained power and influence from ancient Greece. A civil war was fought between 2 men named Marius and Sulla, though Marius eventually died, and Sulla took quite a bit of power. Soon after that, we begin to see the rise of Gaius Julius Caesar, and he formed the first triumvirate with Crassus and Pompey. Though soon this fell apart, because Crassus was killed in battle, and Caesar's head inflated, as he had tremendous military successes in Gaul. Pompey tried legal means to stop Caesar, but he marched on Rome and his army was successful. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was murdered, much to Caesar's dismay. Caesar became essentially dictator for life when he was assassinated by Brutus and Cassius on the Ides of March. A civil war began with Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, and Mark Antony fighting Caesar's assassins, and soon another war broke out between Octavian and Antony, with the former gaining victory. Octavian became Augustus Caesar, and he held almost total power in Rome despite still having a senate. 2 centuries of relative peace followed, called the Pax Romana. Thus the Roman Empire was born, but in its early stages it would already be tested, as it had a series of terrible rulers. Another major event of the time was the birth and the violent death of Jesus Christ, and the persecution of the apostles and the early Christians as well. Jews were another persecuted group, even having Jerusalem get destroyed in 70 AD. Another name that may sound familiar to you is that of Marcus Aurelius, who was the last of the 5 good emperors, who was followed by a terrible emperor, his son Commodus. In the 4th century, Constantine became emperor and converted to Christianity, and attempted to convert his empire along with him. He moved the capital to Byzantium, which then became Constantinople. Successors after him did not like this though, and there was an attempt to restore classical Roman values and religion. The empire then became split between East and West, and the West especially faced many enemies, including the Mycenaean Empire and the Goths. The Western Roman Empire faced many enemies in this time, including the Visigoths, which I mentioned earlier, sacked Rome in 410, and Attila the Hun invaded much of the empire. At last, in 476, Romulus Augustus was removed from the throne, and General Orestes, his father, was killed in battle. From there, the barbarians took over Rome, and the Middle Ages began. Now this spelled the end for the Western Roman Empire, but it certainly didn't for the Eastern Roman Empire, which, as I mentioned previously, was at Constantinople. This existed from 330 to 1453, but that's just the beginning of this chapter, and I will continue it more extensively in an upcoming video about the Middle Ages. Thanks.